Welcome to Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. Washington in Focus is powered by the Center Square and a production of America's Talking Network. You can go check out all of our great podcasts at americastalking.com. Joining me today are two of the best reporters in the state of Washington. That's right. It's Brett Davis and RaeLynn Ricarte. We're recording this on January 27th. And Brett, we're going to start with you this week. And part of it is because there is a saga of a story that we've been following for a couple of weeks. When I was on last time, we were talking about it. When I was on a couple of months ago, we were talking about
the never-ending story.
Yes, and it's about a very fascinating subject that everyone is inherently interested in all the time. I'm joking, but this is an important ruling, but I think for the average listener, it may not be incredibly applicable. But the capital gains tax has its day in Washington's highest court. It finally happened, and I'm guessing that we're not seeing any immediate results coming from this. But what's going on in the courts, Brett?
You are guessing correctly. So yesterday, the tax had there were oral arguments presented both for and against the tax in front of the Washington State Supreme Court. A little bit of background on this. It's a law that was passed in 2021. It's a 7% tax on the sale of, say, stocks and bonds and other high-end assets above $250,000. And in March, a lower court ruled the tax unconstitutional. It was appealed by the Attorney General directly to the Supreme Court, and I believe in July they agreed to take the case. And in November, the Supreme Court, they said the Department of Revenue could go ahead and begin to collect the tax. So we're in this weird situation where the tax actually will start going into effect tomorrow. I believe they'll actually start collecting the tax in February, but oral arguments were actually heard in the case before the Supreme Court yesterday. So
what were the oral arguments about, or do we even know?
Yeah, there was about an hour long discussion between both sides. So the state says that this capital gains tax is an excise tax, which is broadly defined as a tax on certain goods, services, and other activities. They say the transaction, the capital gains, the transaction itself is what triggers the tax. So it's legal in their mind. Opponents say it's a tax on income because a 1933 Supreme Court decision, I know we're going way back in the weeds, that is a property tax. And the state constitution says property taxes must be uniform and limited to 1% a year. And since they're only taxing, capital gain, 7% sale on capital gains above $250,000, they're saying it's not uniform. So it's not constitutional. So that's the gist of it. They went into the weeds a lot more than that, but I don't want to put our readers to sleep with all of that.
Well, so Brett, before the show, you and RaeLynn were chatting about the fact that, being a journalist and when you're covering these things, you almost become a de facto expert on the weeds of the subject matter.
Or at least better informed on those weeds.
Better informed. That might be a better way to put it. Yes. That's a good point.
I had to look up several court cases over the course of this this saga with the capital gains tax. Like I said, I mentioned a case that went back to 1933. So you can see how far back some of these court cases go. Yeah,
you've been kind of going through a crash course of tax law in the state of Washington here.
So yeah, writing this story yesterday it was over 900 words, which is longer than my typical story. So my brain was Swiss cheese by the time I was done with the story.
Well, and Brett, I hate to break it to you, but I have a feeling this thing's going to keep on going, and you're going to have more stories to write about. And hey, maybe we can pull something out of the 1800s to reference, and we can really get
back a few more centuries.
Yeah, we can see how difficult it will be to make you go find these primary sources for your stories and see if you have to go down to the archives and hey, can we pull that out? And then it'll be a whole scene.
But going back to the tax for a second here, it's interesting that the proponents, they asked at the end of the hearing if the court could make a decision quickly, because the legislature, the budget writers in the legislature would like some certainty as far as whether or not they can count on this revenue. So I don't know if the court will take that to heart. I don't think they were.
Did the court give a response, an official response, or was it?
They didn't really say yes or no. I think there was a little bit of, we're going to rule when we rule.
Yeah, that's kind of an implied no, I think. So, right. Brett, do we have an assumed time span that I'm going to ask you to, can you take a guess? Is this going to be a week's process, months process? What do you think?
From what I understand and what I've read and seen, it could take anywhere from a few weeks to a few months, or longer. So I don't really have a specific idea.
probably won't be hearing it next week on Washington in Focus is the
Probably
point.
not.
So, all right. Well, folks, stay on the edge of your seats. Brett Davis will have you covered at thecentersquare.com. And it sounds like he is really excited about continuing to cover this over and over again and finding all the nitty gritty details and get into the weeds. And he might.
The implications are interesting, but it does sometimes take its toll.
Hey, well, at least it's at tax season too, so you'll be able to get away from it,
Right.
when you leave work. That's the good part. Brett, sticking with you, Wednesday morning, there's a couple Republican lawmakers chatting about, pushing a new police pursuit reform bill. What's going on here? And there's some politics at play too that are on kind of, there's the policy aspect, but then there's the politics aspect. Take us through both.
Right. Back in 2021, the legislature passed a bill that basically upped the bar on a threshold for police vehicular pursuits. It went up it went to a probable cause instead of just a reasonable suspicion. And there have been efforts this session to get that back to where it was so police can, more easily engage in vehicular pursuits. Senator Manka Dhingra, she's chair of the Senate's Law and Justice Committee, and she's also the deputy majority leader of the Senate. She's been reluctant to hear the bill, which would eventually, before her committee, which would eventually essentially kill the bill. So she's been reluctant to bring it forward. She's been relying on a study by Dr. Martina Morris that basically says fatalities have been reduced by this law by about 73% in terms of, innocent bystanders. I think the study says it went from 11 people were killed in the year and a half before the law went into effect to about 3 in the year and a half since it's been in effect. But bit of a plot twist. A member of her own party, Rep. Alicia Rule, who has introduced a similar bill in the House, she commissioned an independent review of that study that basically says it's bunk. She had a Matthew, what's the guy's name? Matthew Hickman. He's a Department of Criminal Justice. He's a chair of the Department of Criminal Justice, Criminology and Forensics at Seattle University. He cast doubts on the validity of the study. I'm going to read you what he said here in his result. He said, if this analysis was submitted for peer review, it would be summarily rejected as it does not satisfy threshold criteria for quantitative scientific work. The analysis should be disregarded in its entirety and should not be used to inform legislative decision-making. He basically says the sample size is too small to draw, any broad conclusion. So we have a little bit of a civil war in the Democratic Party on this.
All righty. Is there a seeming conclusion to the Civil War that is likely? Is there a end that is likely, a timeline that to fall along with this? I mean, where is this really headed, or is this going to just die?
It might just die, although Dhingra a couple of days ago said she would hold a hearing on the legislation, but I don't know how accurate that is. She seems to have been a little bit all over the map as far as I can tell, but so I'm not really sure where this is going to go, if anywhere.
Well,
I'll keep my eye on it.
Well, speaking of other things that have tried to go places and haven't gone anywhere, Washington Republicans are taking another crack at emergency powers reform. This all coming a lot from the COVID pandemic, the powers that the governor had taken and held on to for quite a while, which raised some eyebrows.
He declared a COVID emergency in February of 2020, and it ended last Halloween, so about 975 days, but declared emergency.
And there's some Republicans in particular in Washington that feel like that, and correct me if I'm putting this in the wrong light or summarizing this wrong, but that the emergency powers in themselves don't necessarily need to be stripped away, but right. There are questions that should be raised when those emergency powers are extended over a significant period of time.
Right. They want to extend
how many years should they be able to have them?
Right. They want to extend some legislative oversight over the governor's powers. So state reps Chris Corey and Peter Abarno, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, they introduced a bill that would basically limit a state of emergency to 60 days unless extended by the legislature. And it would let lawmakers terminate specific restrictions enacted under that emergency order. It's actually the exact same legislation that was proposed last year, House Bill 1772, that obviously didn't go anywhere. The fate of this bill seems like it might be the same. I know there was a bipartisan bill introduced in the Senate to reform emergency powers, and it's basically being ignored. So I don't know that it's going to go anywhere either. In the last two sessions, the legislature's failed to pass any emergency powers reforms. So.
Is there any indication as to why it may be different this time, or is this just more we're going to keep banging the drum because we think this is something that the public needs to be aware of?
I think your latter characterization is more accurate.
Okay. Well, you have to beg that question when something doesn't go through and the circumstances haven't changed. And it's like, well, what's the purpose of why? I mean, why are we continuing to do this if it's not for a policy change? And so
past efforts on this were done when the emergency order or declaration was still in effect, and it's not. And I think it's just sort of receded in a lot of people's minds. We're not under an emergency rule anymore. So it's not as, in the news as it was.
Alrighty. Well,
maybe less pressure on them.
It's not called. I mean, if they wanted to get really creative with this and maybe get some more press on it, they should maybe like the Julius Caesar bill or something like that. I think that would be a good way to go about it, because I always
too brute.
Well, hey, when I think about because you've heard this only in the last couple of years, obviously out of COVID, but talking about the emergency powers from the executive office and overstepping, I always think of Caesar, and I think that would be clever. So, hey, take that if you want to.
You might be onto something there.
Thank you.
At least more entertaining.
Yeah. If you're going to send a message, at least make it entertaining, right, Brett? All righty. Well, Brett, that's all we've got with you. Sit tight. We're going to head over to RaeLynn. RaeLynn, we've got a lot of different things going on your side of the state of what you cover. The big one has to do with energy and commerce and some news coming out of D.C.
Before I get into that, I want to say really quickly, Brett and I were talking about being government reporters, and it reminded me I went to a newspaper conference, and the reporters could take a whole variety of classes. There were all these, kind of sexy things. And then there was government reporting. And of course I went in there because I was a government reporter, and there were like two of us in that class because it's the meat and potatoes reporting, and it is difficult because you have to get into all of these issues, and you have to find out, like, this is what they're saying. Is that right? And you have to get up to speed on the issues. And so you learn a lot being a government reporter. And when I sat in on the Energy and Commerce Committee, the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which is one of the most powerful committees in Washington because they deal with anything to do with trade, markets, healthcare. I mean, they deal with a broad swath. Anyway, the Republicans have taken over that committee with their majority in the House now, and they are having a series of roundtable discussions to decide what they want to pursue as far as policies. And so they've had 3 of these roundtables, and 2 of them have dealt with fentanyl. And the one that was held Wednesday was really interesting because it wasn't just, we got a problem with fentanyl. They were actually going into specifics about how drug trafficking is working across social media sites. I did not know, for instance, that on Snapchat, messages disappear after a short period of time. So if drug dealers are using them to establish contact with these kids, which Snapchat is attracting through its advertising, et cetera, then, and the parents want to find out information, or law enforcement needs to find out information, there's a limited time to be able to get that information. And if the social media company prevents that from happening, which they seem to be doing a lot of there's a federal law that protects them from liability on lawsuits. And so they have not, I guess, from what was being said at this meeting by law enforcement officials, they have not been really forthcoming with information that would help with death investigations. And fentanyl is now the leading cause of death for 18 to 45-year-olds. So it's a big crisis. They had the sheriff of Spokane County was one of the panelists on there, and he was talking about the problems of trying to get the information from the social media companies and why it was important to reform this Section 230 that gives them immunity, because the immunity was so they could have controversial topics on their sites without, getting banned or getting sued for what people said, but they feel like it's being abused, and it's being used to encourage drug trafficking and other criminal behavior on their sites. And so it was pretty interesting. They had a mother of Amy Neville. Her son Alex was 14 when he took a pill that he thought was prescription drugs, and because fentanyl's made to look like that, the fake pills are made to look like that. China sends the precursors. They manufacture the pills in Mexico. The drug cartels run them up into the United States. And these kids that are dabbling around in recreational drugs think they're taking oxycodone, and it's really fentanyl, and it kills them. And she was talking about the stigma of, a kid dies and everybody wants to blame the parents. The social media companies want to blame the parents, but these kids are not addicts. They're just being kids and experimenting, and they lose their life because they think they're taking some kind of prescription drug, and should they be taking drugs? No, but, people make mistakes in life, and she's saying my son shouldn't have died because he made a mistake, and so she has a foundation, and she, is suing Snapchat with a group that works with victims. And there were two lawyers that were working with victims, and one of them had 50 families. I mean, it was pretty interesting to listen to all of the behind the scenes stuff. The sheriff of Spokane County has hired 7 full-time analysts now to work on gathering evidence through digital platforms, because it is so labor intensive and you have to move fast, because the longer they delay giving you the information, and sometimes they won't even recognize a warrant, the more that information isn't going to be there to pursue the cases. And he calls them homicides. These are homicides.
All righty. Well, a lot to unpack there, and sticking with the Spokane County Sheriff, there's more news coming out about Camp Hope as well.
Mm-hmm. So Camp Hope was Washington's biggest homeless camp on public land. At one point, it had 650 people or so living there. It was formed as a protest over lack of resources for homeless people, and they set it up on Washington Department of Transportation land. And the sheriff who just retired from Spokane County came out and said that he was going to disband it. He had the constitutional authority because it was a chronic nuisance, public health and safety problem. And the new sheriff, John Knowles, has kind of inherited that, plan. But the state agencies have been obstructive about it. It's like, WSDOT is like, they're okay to be here until we find adequate place for them to be. And Department of Commerce, has been not supportive of closing down the camp, without having shelters. The sheriff is saying, we have shelters. These people just don't want to move. The sheriff is saying they're now down to 183 of hardcore people that are not going to go willingly into a shelter. And they need to have all parties, the state agencies and the local officials come together and figure out how to get them into shelters and out of that camp, whether they want to be there or not.
And then the final story we want to talk about today with you, RaeLynn, Spokane County, they approve funding to boost the medical staff at the jail after a $27 million verdict came down. Let's start with that verdict. And obviously the funding is a result of that. So what happened with that $27 million verdict?
So Cindy Hill, an inmate at the jail, died of, basically she wasn't treated for respiratory issues, and she died at the jail, and they had video footage that the county allowed to lapse, even knowing there was this court case pending that was evidence in the case. And so, the county got reprimanded by the judge for that. And ultimately, I think maybe that helped play into this $27 million verdict to her family for a wrongful death. The NaphCare, the company that provides medical services to the jail, asked the county for about $350,000 more dollars to hire more people there. And the county gave that money because in light of the lawsuit, they felt like, they needed to do something with the services there. The jail supervisor said that he felt that company was doing a good job, even though there's been this lawsuit. Anyway, so they're going to be upping the amount of medical staffers that they have at the jail, and hoping that, there's no more untimely deaths like that in the jail. She was sick and just didn't get treatment soon enough. And by the time that she did, she was dead.
So we are deciding to take a step back, reevaluate the process of how inmates are being treated in terms of their health care, and trying to address this both from the life aspect of it for sure, but also there is the obvious liability aspect that comes along with that.
Right. Like when an inmate dies in jail, they have to, they'll put that out, and then they'll do an investigation into why they die. And I think it's good. The accountability piece is good. Like you need to know that people who are inside are receiving the services that they need humanely,
Check out that story and all the stories we talked about today at thecentersquare.com. Brett Davis, RaeLynn, Ricarte, thank you both for joining me today and chatting about some news out of the state of Washington.
Thanks for filling in.
I feel like I'm the regular at this point, Brett.
I know, right?
You might have a point there.
That's about all the time we have this week on Washington in Focus. Washington in Focus is powered by the Center Square and a production of America's Talking Network. Go check out all of our great podcasts at americastalking.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, subscribe, leave us a review. If you want to keep supporting us, there's a link in the description. You can send over a donation as well. We're open to that. Helps us to keep these great news stories being churned out. So for RaeLynn, Ricarte, Brett Davis, I'm Cole McNeely. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next week.